She was like,
Before we begin, I want to take a moment and announce that yesterday the Metropolitan
Water District of Southern California voted to provide additional funds to build the Cal Water Fix, which I know you're aware of, Mr. Secretary. It's a big deal. I'm happy that the project is moving forward. Providing consistent water supply to the people of Southern California has been a long-term goal of mine, and I know a lot of people feel the same way. So anyway, we're making progress. Now on to the business of the day. This morning, I'd like to welcome the subcommittee, the 52nd Secretary of Interior, Ryan Zinke. Joining the Secretary this morning is Olivia Ferriter. How do you pronounce that? Ferriter. And Deputy Assistant Secretary for Budget, Finance, Performance, and Acquisition, as well as Denise Flanagan, Director, Office of the Budget. Our hearing today will address the fiscal year 2019 budget priorities for the Department of Interior. We look forward to your outlining your goals for the department, discussing a variety of important issues with us this morning. We're very pleased to have recently completed work on fiscal year 2018 budget. The Interior Division of the Omnibus made tremendous strides by providing over $500 million to address long-standing deferred maintenance needs across the department's various bureaus. Within Indian Country, we provide funding to increase school construction, law enforcement, road maintenance, and water settlements. We allocate an additional $255 million to the National Park Service, with an emphasis on park operations and deferred maintenance. Also, we provided $530 million to provide or fully fund the payments in lieu of taxes, the so-called PILT program. But as you know, Mr. Secretary, last year's challenges remain this year's challenges. As we approach the fiscal year 2019 budget, we'll continue addressing the maintenance backlog in our national parks across the various interior bureaus, meeting our legal and moral obligations throughout Indian Country, funding PILT and numerous other challenges. This subcommittee remains committed to working with the department to seek solutions to these and many other issues. Overall, the President's fiscal year 2019 budget request provides $10.6 billion in discretionary funding for the Department of Interior programs under this subcommittee jurisdiction, which is $2.4 billion below the fiscal year 2018 enacted level. In fiscal year 2018, Congress clearly had some priorities that were not included in your budget request, and I suspect that may be the case again this year in 2019. In bipartisan fashion, under both Republican and Democratic chairmen, this subcommittee has made a concerted effort to address the greatest needs throughout Indian Country. Education, health care, and law enforcement issues continue to be nonpartisan subcommittee priorities, particularly those that are on the GAO high-risk list. We welcome your active involvement working with us and our American Indian and Alaska Native brothers and sisters. Another challenge facing the department and the subcommittee is the Endangered Species Act. The ESA is a well-intended statute to save numerous species from extinction, but actually recovering and delisting species remain a challenge and an increasing source of frustration for states and many local communities. This frustration is demonstrated in many ways, including the number of ESA riders which we have on our appropriation bills in recent years. The path forward is through partnerships in the field rather than as adversaries in courtrooms and hearing rooms. The subcommittee has heard from states and non-governmental partners that are willing and able to take on larger roles under the ESA when the federal government treats them as equal partners. Flexibilities already inherent in the ESA make these partnerships possible, and the subcommittee is working on a bipartisan basis to foster more of them. We appreciate the Fish and Wildlife Service's willingness to change from within, but we also need your continued leadership. We need conservation without conflict. I'm glad to see that the USGS budget includes full funding for Landstat 9 and proposes funding for domestic and critical minerals inventory. However, again, it proposes to eliminate the earthquake warning system, despite the fact the West Coast, in my home state of California, is counting on the survey to develop this technology. It's safe to say that this subcommittee won't agree to eliminate this program. Instead, I hope you will work with us to ensure the fiscal year 2018 funding is spent effectively and appropriately, and that you'll provide the subcommittee with the data we need to make informed decisions for fiscal year 2019. Lastly, we look forward to hearing the latest on your proposal to reorganize the department under a framework of common regional boundaries across the department bureaus. I applaud your effort to identify efficiencies and reduce redundancies and also want to stress the importance of seeking input from many stakeholders at the federal, state, tribal, and local level, and even members of Congress who are affected by such changes. In closing, again this year, I want to express my appreciation to your outstanding professional staff. Our subcommittee couldn't do its work without your budget shop, the various bureaus, and the talented people sitting next to you and behind you. Thanks to each of you for all that you do. And with that, I'm happy to yield to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Mrs. McCollum, any opening remarks you would like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Zinke, thank you for being with us this morning. We're here to discuss President Trump's second budget. 2 months ago, Congress passed a bipartisan budget agreement to increase non-defense discretionary spending for 2 years. 3 weeks ago, the fiscal year 2018 omnibus bill was enacted into law with both Democratic and Republican votes. This omnibus sent a clear message that Congress rejects President Trump's reckless proposals, which would exploit our natural resources, starve our federal agencies of the funding they need to meet their critical missions, and jeopardize a legacy we would leave for future generations. The proposed reduction of $2.5 billion for Interior is staggering. To me, it indicates a deliberate disregard for that agreement. It's disappointing, but not surprising, worthwhile investments that we made across the Bureau, including the highest funding levels in years to address the maintenance backlogs in our national parks and other federal lands, are being undone. President Trump's first year in office has been remarkably damaging to our environment, public health, and natural resources. And today we will discuss some of those damaging policies. The National Monuments Review has proven to be a sham, with preconceptions that benefit the fossil fuel industry. Last year you said, and I quote, "Bear's ears really isn't about oil and gas." Investigative reporting by the New York Times has found gaining access to oil, natural gas, and uranium reserves played a central role in shrinking Bear's ears by nearly 85%. Your staff also developed projections on coal deposits to justify reducing the Grand Staircase monuments by 47%. The pristine and diverse ecosystems protected in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is threatened by a relentless and hasty pushing for drilling. This irresponsible proposal was pushed through in the Republican tax scam, yet another one of the bill's giveaways to big corporations and billionaires. And even the tax bill explodes the federal deficit by nearly $2 trillion. The revenue claim from drilling in ANWR is totally unsupported by the data. Reckless push to mine and drill in our public lands is also hitting my home state, where sulfide ore mining poses a critical risk to the Voyageurs National Park and the Boundary Waters Wilderness Canoe Area. Officials in the Interior Department recently renewed grants to a Chilean mining company as a non-discretionary right to renew 2 mining leases on the doorsteps of the country's most visited national wilderness. I am not even going to get into your flawed rollout of the 5-year offshore leasing plan and how you promised to remove areas before the comment period was even over. Although the outcry on these policies has been great, the harm done by the Trump administration extends beyond drilling and mining issues. It has impacted the integrity of science, access to our parks, and now threatens to disrupt the entire Interior Department as you propose to create a new organizational model with no foundational analysis. The department's science programs provide data and tools to inform sound science, making decisions to address complex challenges such as drought, natural disasters, and climate change. Scientific integrity is essential to ensure that there is no bias or preconceived agenda in the information issued by the department. And I am particularly concerned that senior leadership at the department requested U.S. Geological Survey to violate its policies regarding USGS data. Furthermore, the Center for Investigative Reporting found the National Park Service deleted every mention of climate change from drafts and long-awaited report on sea level rise and storm surge. These findings contradict your March testimony before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, in which you stated there was no incidence when DOI changed even a comma in a report. You even challenged any member to find and alter document, and now we have that proof. This clear interference of political leadership is forcing employees to violate their scientific integrity policies, and it must stop. I'm very disappointed in the way that you rolled out your proposal to dramatically increase the fees at the 17 national parks with little analysis or consideration of public access. Tens of thousands of Americans voiced their opposition through public comment periods, and thankfully, so far, sir, you have listened. You have stated that you want to reorganize the department for the next 100 years and are proposing 13 new regions. But I have serious concerns, and I've asked to talk to you about this numerous times. You are not able to share any analysis on the effects of the proposal. You've had no formal public input. You have not solicited comments from other agencies, and you have not conducted meaningful tribal consultation. I have heard directly from the tribes. Mr. Secretary, you must do better. The department that serves the American public, that tells the story of America, should reflect America's diversity and should never marginalize minorities. In June, when you reassigned 33 career senior executives, almost half of them were minorities. 40% were women, 30% were Native Americans. Apparent discrimination is wrong. Mr. Secretary, your task is to protect, preserve, and use resources wisely for the benefit of the American people today and for future generations. And right now, I personally do not feel you're living up to that mission. For the record, I want to be clear. There is a place for responsible resource development on our public lands, but it must be balanced and it must be sustainable. I find it alarming that this administration continues to prioritize energy dominance and profits for the fossil fuel industry over the protection of our national treasures, conservation of our natural habitat, and our responsibilities to the American people. This budget is unacceptable. But, Mr. Chairman, I am pledging to work with you to ensure that the Department of Interior has the necessary funding so that all Americans can continue to enjoy our natural lands and our cultural resources for today and for future generations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I appreciate your testimony. And next, we are joined today by our distinguished chairman of the full committee, Chairman Frelinghuysen, and thank him for taking time to contribute to this important conversation.
Well, thank
Chairman,
you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time, and I want to thank you on Ms. Lowy and on my behalf for your leadership of this important committee, and of course also welcome our Secretary of Interior, Ryan Zinke, a former member and colleague back. We welcome your testimony and hearing your frank and candid views on many issues. As I say at every meeting, the power of the purse resides here on the Hill, and I think we've done, through your leadership, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. McCollum's good work for the 2018 budget, and as well as we can anticipate the same type of devotion of you and your staff and your committee towards the 2019 product. When I travel across the 11th Congressional District in New Jersey, the Department of Interior strong presence cannot be missed. We have 2 National Historic Parks, actually the oldest in the country, established in my hometown in 1933, called the Marston National Historic Park. We also have the Thomas Edison National Historic Park in West Orange. Additionally, we have the National Wildlife Refuge System's Great Swamp Wildlife Refuge, which, as fact be known, was established by my father when he was a member of Congress. There's no conflict in our neck of the woods about the job that the Department of Interior is doing. There may be conflict in the West, but in our neck of the woods, Mr. Secretary, we hold the people who work for the Department of Interior in high regard. I just want you to know that. And may I say, I am concerned that there are cuts across the Park Service, and particularly in the area of fish and wildlife. And I think I personally will be taking a very close look at that. Hopefully the committee will as well. And lastly, I say apropos of some of the remarks that have been given, New Jersey has a shoreline of about 127 miles. All members of our congressional delegation have opposed historically for the last 20 or 30 years offshore drilling. I understand the administration may have contrary views. But I hope that in the coming weeks, and perhaps with the benefit of your testimony this morning, that you recognize, obviously, the concerns that many of us have on the East Coast of the United States, that we don't want oil drilling in our neck of the woods. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm also pleased to see our ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Elwha, is here today. I'm happy to yield gentlelady her time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Chairman Calvert and Ranking Member McCollum for holding this hearing, and I welcome Secretary Zinke before the subcommittee. Secretary Zinke, it's been a little over a year since you took your oath of office. Despite your testimony last year indicating a commitment to preserving America's public lands for generations to come, your actions have strayed from that promise. Under your leadership, the Department of the Interior has brushed off expressed opposition from Native Americans in order to reduce the size of two important national monuments, Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante. Proposed drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and in Atlantic waters, weakened protections for endangered species, proposed to significantly raise entrance fees at national parks, which I am thankful you are reconsidering, and work to unravel environmental protections and important steps to combat climate change. If funding must be cut so severely that we jeopardize our environment, conservation efforts, and the accessibility of our national parks, some of our most precious resources, then I expect that the same would be true of your travel arrangements and the accoutrements in which you surround yourself. Doors costing $139,000, about which you do not notify this committee, in contravention of Section 710 of the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Bill, and extravagant trips have violated a trust with this institution and with American taxpayers. I'm disappointed that your budget reflects a continued adherence to your misguided priorities. For instance, some of your actions, like flying a flag when present at the department or handing out commemorative coins with your name on them, indicate that perhaps your ego has gotten in the way of doing the business of the people. The FY 2019 budget proposes a reduction of $2.5 billion to your department, a 19% reduction from the FY 2018 omnibus. This second Trump administration budget would eliminate several programs of importance, such as the National Heritage Areas in your Interior budget, as well as the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities and the Woodrow Wilson Center. I certainly could go on to list the many aspects of your budget that value political agenda and mismanagement above the interests of the taxpayers, but my time is limited. With that, I look forward to your testimony.
Thank the gentlelady for her testimony, and with that, Mr. Secretary, you may proceed with your opening statement.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking members, even though the openings were false, misleading, and blatantly untruthful. But having said that, thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of President Trump's fiscal year 2019 budget for the Department of Interior. And with your permission, I'd like to make my entire opening statement for the record.
Without objection.
So the President has made it clear about his priorities and is keeping his promises to the American people. This budget supports one of those promises in a big way, rebuilding our infrastructure. It calls for the largest investment in public lands infrastructure in American history. And I'll repeat that. It calls for the largest investment in public lands infrastructure in American history. Our public lands, we agree, are our greatest treasures. They have suffered serious neglect over years, and Interior's deferred maintenance backlog is $16 billion, $11.6 billion of that belongs in the National Park Service. And I can give you 11.6 billion reasons why Congress has not been able to fix it. The President budget proposes legislation for a new public lands infrastructure fund to address the deferred maintenance problem. This legislation is our top priority. The fund would provide up to $18 billion over 10 years for maintenance and improvements in our national parks, our National Wildlife Refuges, and Bureau of Indian Education funded schools. It would be funded from energy revenues, all energy revenues on public lands, similar to the Land and Conservation Fund. I repeat, all energy across the board. I believe it's a fair proposition to say if you're going to gain wealth from energy development on public lands, the public lands should in fact be preserved and protected from those activities. In 2006, 330 million visitors to our parks spent an estimated $18.4 billion in local regions nationwide, supporting about 318,000 jobs. Clearly, recreation trends are up. All Americans should have the opportunity to enjoy our national park, but we need to invest in our infrastructure to go along with the record-setting numbers. Quite frankly, many of our parks are being loved to death. The Public Lands Infrastructure Fund would also support 150 Bureau of Education schools in 23 states, where the school maintenance backlog is about $634 million. Some 48,000 American Indian students and their families rely on the interior to deliver a quality education and a safe work environment, but our schools are notoriously in poor condition. American Indian children deserve a world-class education too. This budget also presents the opportunity to reorganize the department for the next 100 years, and I look forward to going into that in some detail. The budget includes $18 million to shift resources to the field and establish unified regional boundaries for Interior's bureaus. In planning for this reorganization, we continue to take into account feedback from congressional members, governors, Interior employees, conservation groups, and all stakeholders. We are basing these new boundaries on science, to include such things as watersheds, wildlife corridors, ecosystems, so we can better manage our public lands and waters in a more coordinated way based on the American conservation ethic of best science, best practice, greatest good, longest term. This budget also recognizes that American strength relies on American energy. Under President Trump, we are pursuing energy dominance. Today, I'm happy to report that this country is producing about 10.6 million barrels a day. First time in 60 years, we are a net exporter of liquid natural gas, and we're soon to become the largest oil and natural gas producer in the world. This budget requests $43 million increase for American energy development to continue our revenue growth from production. President Trump's tax cuts and smart regulation are helping to grow the economy and increase our energy portfolios so we can achieve American prosperity. Our total budget request for fiscal year 2019 is $11.7 billion. This budget clearly lays out the administration's top priorities of strongly supporting the American people in rebuilding our infrastructure, fixing our schools, achieving energy dominance, and being fiscally responsible. I remind you that the budget deficit is about $1 trillion this year. With that, thank you for your continued support of the department. I appreciate your hard work, and I appreciate a cordial and fruitful discussion with all members.
Well, I thank the gentleman for coming out here today. We have a number of things we'd like to discuss. Last September, the department unveiled a reorganization proposal that you mentioned in your opening testimony. Contemplated establishing common regional office boundaries across the Department of Interior bureaus. And as I understand it, your goal is to improve coordination and decision-making among the department's bureaus. I applaud your efforts to identify efficiencies, reduce redundancies within the department. I also want to stress, though, the importance of seeking input from and providing feedback from those that are potentially affected. It just makes good sense, and people would like to hear from you about all this, both from the federal, state, tribal, and local level as this moves forward. Can you update the subcommittee on the present status of your efforts to reorganize the department, and what specific goals or outcomes are you seeking to achieve?
Well, thank you. Imagine an Interior Department organization that hasn't been reorganized in 150 years. Welcome to Interior. Let me explain one of the problems. let's say you have a trout and a salmon in the same stream. Let's say upstream you have a dam, downstream you have irrigation, and if that stream passes by a U.S. Forest Service holding. At presently, this is how we're managing it. The salmon are managed by Department of Commerce through NIMS. The trout are managed by Fish and Wildlife through us. Upstream, water temperature and flow is often the Army Corps of Engineers, although it sometimes can be Bureau of Reclamation depending on the dam. Downstream irrigation is generally Bureau of Reclamation. When it passes a Forest Service holding, surface is Department of Ag through U.S. Fish and Wildlife or through U.S. Forest Service. Subsurface is BLM through me. Same stream, same activity. You can have multiple biological opinions produced by different bureaus with different missions, independently produced, and 2 or 3 of them are going to be in conflict. The chart you have is presently how Interior is managed. So looking at that, I challenge you to figure out how Interior can get things done currently. So this is what we did. We asked USGS to strip current boundaries and go by science. So look at things like watersheds, wildlife corridors, holdings based on science, and they had about 13 different variables. Then we took the pure science and we brought in our senior SES, our senior civil career professionals, and they murderboarded it and they made recommendations. Even though I didn't agree with every recommendation, I took every recommendation, and we came with, next slide please. Oh, we came with unified boundaries. They are similar, the 13, they're similar in some cases to state lines, but mostly they follow a watershed line. Within those new boundaries, they're unified so that Fish and Wildlife and national parks and Bureau of Reclamation can be in the same geographical units. Then we're focusing on 3 areas: recreation, NEPA, and permitting, and it is our intent to do those jointly. Recreation is an $887 billion industry, and things like trail systems, bike systems should connect. We should have a system that is supporting and in harmony with recreation rather than just doing it by isolated assets. Similarly, with permitting, you have to have all stakeholders at the table, and NEPA is similar. We need all stakeholders. So where we are in the process is we looked at our current problem. We identified that we needed to be more joint in the decisions. We then, on the basis of science, USGS did the 13 regions. Then we had the SESs review that. We brought the governors in. The governor concern was BLM. We decided we're going to keep the state directors for the BLM because that's an important relationship. And I've talked to Simon Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot III, and we're having a roundtable of conservationists to take a look at it. We want to do it right, and we want to make sure that we coordinate with you before we go forward on it. But this is where we sit currently. It's 13 regions, just trying to unify our regions. This is not a new idea. We fight forest fires jointly, and certainly the United States military overseas conducts its operations in a joint manner. There's no reason why Interior can't move to this model.
Just quickly, before I can move on to the ranking member, is the department engaged in any substantive consultation with governors, tribes, and state and local officials affected by this reorganization?
We are. And the nations, they're sovereign. So we are beginning consultation, and whether or not they adopt this model is really up to them. As I've always said that I believe the nations are sovereign, and it's a partnership, it's a relationship. So I think it's to their advantage to join, especially in recreation, NEPA, and permitting, but we'll enter a consultation on whether or not BIA, which is unique in Interior because BIA is the people department, unlike some of our other departments that manage lands or wildlife, the people department, it is yet undetermined whether or not they'll be incorporated into that.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we get feedback from the tribes and other constituencies, and especially the tribes, because I've heard from a few that feel that they're not part of the process. So I have your assurance that they will be, and that you're going to stay in touch with them.
And again, whether or not the BIA gets incorporated in this model will be up to the results of the consultations and the nations.
Because I'm looking at this map real quick, you know, for instance, the Navajo tribe, I'm quite sure it moves over to several of these proposed basins and so forth. And so some of these might be a little more complex. But with that, Ms. McCullum.
I do have some questions on reprogramming, but I'm just going to make a, and when we talked in December, I said I'd like to have someone come in and brief me and talk to me about this, and I've been available, and I guess maybe we can finally do it now that I have a map in my hand for the first time. But I just want to make one comment before I go to the question that I want to get to, and I'm just, being from one of the Great Lakes states, knowing how the governors from the Great Lakes work together, know how all the water districts work together up there, and the tribes work together under the Great Lakes region, I am baffled a little bit by this draft map breaking up the Great Lakes the way it does, but we can get into that in more detail later. Talk about direct spending and reprogramming. Congress has provided significant increases to the department in the fiscal year 2018 bill. And a statement that accompanies the bill provides direction on how the department is supposed to spend the money. So I'd like you to comment on the way that you're going to adhere to the directives and the explanatory statement. And will you ensure that appropriate programs receive the funding levels that have been congressionally directed? We've also included extensive direction about reprogramming requirements, stated our intention to include the bill language in fiscal year 2019. Are you familiar as to date of what these requirements are, and will you commit to working with the committee to develop language in order to avoid any barriers to implementation?
Well, and I follow the law, and we had a conversation about a grant process, and I have a stack of IG reports on my desk about grants, and the intent of Congress should be followed on distribution of grants. But I also have an obligation to make sure when the grants are given that we follow up that money was actually spent delivering on congressional intent, and we follow up on it. In a lot of cases, we have not followed up on grants, as well as the grant process. There was kind of some deep and very concerning conflicts of interest with how grants were awarded, and I'll share the IG reports. So we've changed the process. The other thing on grants, particularly with the climate change grants that we talked about, is they are not asking for the grants until we get funded. So what we needed to do, and we've taken the process of pre-clearing those, so when they get funding, those grants can be actually executed. So what was occurring is the grants were not being submitted to the headquarters until we had funding, and then all of a sudden, you know, the process, everything was being held up. So we've reversed that trend. If they're pre-approved and in the priority of the congressional intent, then we should be able to get them out. It's not my job to dismantle congressional intent. It's my job to execute congressional intent. And if we have any questions, that's where a dialogue comes back and forth. Also, I might mention about Bears Ears. I'm a geologist. I can assure you that oil and gas in Bears Ears was not part of my decision matrix. A geologist will tell you there is little, if any, oil and gas And there's no proposal that I've seen to mine uranium in the former area of Bears Ears. And the geology is clear on that. So I won't go into line by line of some of the other comments, but I certainly can. But I'm willing to discuss anything with you. But I can assure you, I follow the law. I look at best practices. I make sure that every time we look at things, it's on my travel schedule, by the way. You'll find in the reports coming up that I followed every law, regulation, procedure, policy across the board. Every time I travel, it's reviewed by career ethics and approved prior. It's approved and looked at by legal folks. The previous secretary, for instance, on travel, took 80 trips over $1 million. And Sally Jewell, she took commercial or charter planes to hike. You know what? She was approved to do that because hiking in some of our areas is exactly what a secretary should do. I took 3 trips for $17,000, and it was the only available transportation available. Only transportation available to meet the schedule. I understand we live in a political environment back and forth, but on every case, I follow the exact
Mr. Chair,
policy,
that wasn't my
regulation,
question. Is this
procedures.
counting against my time?
I will not call it against your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In fairness, so everybody gets to ask a question, I hope we have a second round because I would like to get more into a couple of other issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Amadei.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, first of all, I want to thank you for kind of acting as a life coach during a lonely 2 hours in the Salt Lake airport a few months ago when I expressed some frustration with the general state of affairs in my life, of course not yours, but anyhow. So I want to publicly say thank you for helping a non-Navy guy out for a former Army JAG. I appreciate that. And having said that, I also want to say thank you for being responsive in terms of hooking me up with Mr. Tanner, although he's from Utah, has been a very able guy, and I've enjoyed the exchange we've had. I've enjoyed the fact that I had a chance to visit with Ms. Coombs in your office recently to talk about the reorganization stuff, and I heard you say again today, so I won't say anything else about it. I'm happy to hear that we're talking about the importance of BLM state directors, and so we'll leave it at that. I do, you know, as I listen to the chairman of the whole committee talk about the importance of what's going on in New Jersey, and that's very important in the other parts around the nation, I do feel an obligation to go, well, with all due respect, one of your bureaus, the Bureau of Land Management, owns the equivalent of about 25 or 30 New Jerseys in my state. And I say that to say that the mission of the Bureau in my state is phenomenally important because the jurisdiction that your folks have there is about 7 times that of the governor, the legislature, every county commission, and every city council. So those people are very, very important when we talk about multiple use and land management for basically everything they do in their mission except probably timber, although we do have trees in Nevada, and offshore issues because we don't have any coastline. So having said that, I would like to ask for an opportunity, obviously not during this hearing, to get with Ms. Ferriter and talk about the need for, because we've done some work in terms of what staffing looked like a decade ago, what it looks like now, most of which was not during your tenure. But it's like, hey, it's important that to the extent that we have budgeted positions to do things on the non-fire side of the house, and I'm not a guy who says more money is the answer to everything, but it's like if we need personnel to do the mission, then I think that's the statement. So I want to get a little deeper, obviously not in this hearing, into how that looks in terms of regular operations of the Bureau in Nevada. So how that looks with what we did with the Omni as a starting point, and then what we're talking about doing with this year's, although I know when it gets to the Senate that that's a different planet, and I'll just leave that at that. But having said that, I really want to sit down and go, hey, so how do we do, so quite frankly, if there's 4 real estate positions in in western Nevada, that those are filled and that those people are doing their job. Nobody leave the room and said that I expect the Bureau to give everybody a yes or something like that, but we do expect realistic timeframes when you talk about fulfilling the mission. You didn't, and I notice in your statement that you've got a reference to SNPLMA and doing some stuff with some of those funds, and I'll just join in the chairman's comments about another program that while I'm all for looking at everything, I'm probably going to urge the committee not to strip the SNPLMA funds out of the account because they're unobligated, and I know that'll come as a shock to your staff and everything else. The final thing I would like to do is I would like to get together and speak with your appropriate folks, and maybe that's the undersecretary, but quite frankly, I've got a concern about solicitor operations in my state, because quite frankly, the solicitor isn't in my state. And so, no offense to the chairman here who lives in the Golden State, but you know what? Having a solicitor in Sacramento making decisions that affect Las Vegas, Elko, Winnemucca, that have to interpret Nevada water law, sometimes that kind of gets left out. Yeah, and so while I appreciate the value of legal advice, being a recovering lawyer myself, I just have a concern about, quite frankly, that there's a lot of district managers going up. The solicitor and whatever said this, and so end of discussion, and then I end up calling up Mr. Steed or somebody else like that to say, hey, can we have somebody take a 360-degree look? So with that, I'll make it real hard on you. Do you have any objection to me bothering Ms. Ferriter or discussing with your folks the solicitor stuff? And if you don't, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, John. In fact, all three of them.
No, and I don't have any objection to any member of this committee, both sides, you know, fully engaging the staff on issues. And up front, I don't know all the answers. I have really good people around me that work hard, and we'll get there. But as a former member, I think it's important that we do have a dialogue. Even though we may agree or disagree, we shouldn't agree to disagree, and that we should be cordial and we should work for common goals. I don't think there's anyone in this committee that doesn't love public lands. And I don't think there's anyone in this committee that doesn't want to see better management of public lands, long-term, greatest good. So with that, your comment was, just to answer really shortly, we are short in the field. Every time I go out, we're too short in the field, we're too long in the headquarters. And the decisions a lot of times are made in D.C., which don't reflect local priorities. Asian carp, for instance, if you're in the Michigan watershed area, Asian carp's a big deal. So is zebra mussels, not so much in D.C. And so part of the idea about the reorganization is to go based on science and watersheds as a baseline, wildlife corridors, and try to push those important decisions and the priority down within different regions. So things like Asian carp can be addressed as important as it is within these new unified regions. And when you have the fish and the trout scenario, and every bureau has different priorities and structurally different, we need to get the stakeholders working jointly, I think, in the three areas: recreation, NEPA, and permitting, so we can make better decisions sooner.
Yeah. Thank you. Ms. Finley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for being with us today and in the spirit of friendliness. I think I mentioned to you once that my first visit to Montana was the Bob Marshall Wilderness. I went on a pack trip, and the thing that struck me was the similarities between our state, even though you have mountains and you're landlocked, we have oceans. I do think you bring a perspective of a rural state, and some of the same concerns. I think we have a lot of similarities with our natural resource base and other issues. But I want to focus my question on the thing you don't have in Montana, which is offshore oil drilling. I sent a letter along with the Democrats on the committee. I'm happy to give you another copy of it, and that was just to ask you to explain a little more about the process that we're going through to do this. We have had enormous concerns from our constituents about the possibilities of doing this. When you made the announcement, it seemed as though it was somewhat arbitrary given how many states raised concerns. You heard the chair of Appropriations this morning on the Republican side talk about the concerns in New Jersey And certainly we have had a decades-old ban on doing this, and there are good reasons for that. In my state, people think the science is clear, and they're very worried about the economic impact. Tourism is the largest industry in Maine, $5.6 billion, 71% of which comes from our coast. Fishing is a very important part of our culture, our history. Lobster fishing alone brings in $500 million. Our fishermen are up in arms about this possible idea and the potential damage that could be done with offshore oil drilling and any danger that comes with that. We're concerned about the process. We did have a visit from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to Maine, and while many of my constituents had planned and hoped that they could speak in a public hearing, these were fishermen, these were small business owners who wanted to come forward and say what was on their mind. The format was very different, and I appreciate your department explaining that to me, but really it was more of a one-on-one. You could visit a booth, you could talk to somebody about it, but you really couldn't register your public complaint. And I think this has been very upsetting to people in Maine. So I want to know a little bit more about this decision-making process. I know you've said at times we have a governor who has been favorable towards this. He won't be the governor because of term limits after the end of this year. And our legislature voted very strongly to oppose this. Our entire congressional delegation, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, are opposed to this. And we were shocked to see that you would exempt Florida, even though that many Mainers spend their winter in Florida, and we don't want them to have an oil spill either. The fact is that was kind of an arbitrary decision and very upsetting to, I think, most of the other Atlantic states. So I'm happy to pass along that letter to you, give you the resolution that our legislature passed in opposition, but can you tell me a little bit more about the process?
Absolutely.
And frankly, why did you exempt Florida and not us? We deserve it more.
And I didn't want it. Florida is not exempt because they're still going through the process. But let me explain what we did. If you go back to 2008, Interior made about $18 billion a year just in oil and gas. When I came in office, we made 2.6. So we dropped $15 billion in revenue a year. On scale, that would have covered our entire backlog of maintenance in the three primary areas. So it was a decision of mine. Rather than looking at 94% taken off, I said, let's do a zero-based budget and let's put everything on. And let's have a discussion as America about priorities and importance of oil and gas. Now, having said that, it's interesting that, clearly on the East Coast, what we're seeing, and I've talked to your governor and Georgia, both of them are either favorable or neutral. The rest of the governors are opposed. But also is that the oil and gas revenues, for instance, in Maine, there isn't any oil and gas really of significance, and the only play really is called the Mid-Atlantic. It is starts in northern Georgia and kind of goes up to Virginia, and it's some distance off the coast, as far as about 70 miles. We think it's a gas play. We don't really have a lot of geologic definity on it. What's also happening is there's no doubt that drilling offshore is more risky than onshore. What we're seeing as a country is investments are moving onshore to the Permian because it's not as risky, and also there's no infrastructure. Unlike the Gulf Coast, there is no subsea infrastructure. So were to you begin a offshore oil and gas play on the East Coast, you would have to start from scratch. The other thing, states matter. The local voice matters, you matter, and the governor matters. And as we go through there, we are shaping our plan to make sure that we accommodate local voices. Fishermen matter. And fishermen aren't very happy about wind either, that I just was up announcing some fairly large and significant wind leases off the coast. But we want to make sure that the stakeholders, and when we do our wind, for instance, same thing, is we want to make sure we design the fields so we don't negatively impact our fishing fleets. So we're going through the process. I committed in Florida. Florida's different. They have a moratorium in place. a federal moratorium that prevents oil and gas. So looking at it, both parties, every member and the governor asked me for a meeting. And I committed no new oil and gas platforms off the coast of Oregon. What was driving is every member, both sides, where the oil and gas resources are, an immediate meeting. And you would have thought that I would have been applauded by the Democrats on that side, but they somehow they agreed with the policy. They didn't agree how I did it. So, but they're still going through the process. Again, it's not a rule. This is a plan. And so we're trying to get the first draft out in the fall. Again, in the state of Maine, most of the areas, A, you don't have resources off the coast. B, you don't have an infrastructure in place. And C, most of the districts along the coast and communities are not in favor of oil and gas. And while most of them are in favor of wind, as long as they don't see it. So wind has to be over the horizon. There's less opposition to gas, but quite frankly, we don't have the data, but in particular. And the last thing about seismic is also required for wind. And seismic is also, in some cases, required for going out and mining for sand, for reclamation. So, and mining of sand off the coast, which we do an enormous amount of mining, is far more destructive than any seismic. But we have to be careful about saying we don't want science on the best possible technology to look at what's there. And same thing with wind. You have to make sure that when you auger these platforms in, that you're in stable ground, or if you should mine, making sure we look at the environmental effects. So that's where we are on it. We'll get you probably the draft as soon as we get done. We are taking public comment, and I think I know exactly where everyone sits on both coasts.
Well, thank you for the follow-up, and I certainly will look forward to seeing the draft. I think you, in fact, made a lot of good arguments about why Maine should be exempted, and perhaps you could commit to, after this next election cycle, if I'm lucky enough to be here and our state will have a different governor, if we're all on the same page, maybe you can meet with us, we'll have everyone aligned, and you can say, oh, well, Maine shouldn't have it either, and just get this off the table sooner rather than later.
I'm sure Maine's going to be very happy with the draft proposal.
Well, thank you.
Mr. Jenkins.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you, Mr. Secretary. Great to be part of your class of 2014, and you've done good. Appreciate you. A couple of quick questions. One, I just wanted to sensitize you to something that Chairman Calvert, Chairman Rogers, and I've been very involved with, and that's the AML pilot program. We just in the Omni re-upped for a third year of that, and I just wanted to share with you the positive things that are happening in West Virginia. I'm sure Chairman Rogers could do the same from Kentucky, of how that this program project is working. This is taking previous AML properties, using funds to make connections to economic development possibilities. Just the one kind of seed, when at the state level these AML projects are identified, approved, meet the criteria, they do go back up the food chain, get reviewed in Washington, and we still don't quite have the timeliness turnaround that I think we ought to be able to achieve. So I would like to work with your AML folks, OSM office, to try to expedite, because that was the intent, is to get these funds dispensed quickly and these projects out in the field. The second would like your assistance on, and first with a compliment, King Coal Highway, my philosophy, as go the roads, so go the jobs. And the King Coal project, which was taking actively mined out property, leaving the roadbed, and being able to come in at a significantly reduced amount of cost to the taxpayers building roads. And this project has been held in abeyance for almost 10 years because of regulatory red tape, and thanks to President Trump, thanks to this administration, cutting through the red tape, and in particular, thank you to the EPA. We have been able to clear an important hurdle to get this project on the road to being constructed. But we still have a Fish and Wildlife Service issue that has cropped up. So really just wanted to plant the seed once again. Thank you for the work that's being done. I think we are heading in the right direction, but we still have some bumps in the road, and we would like to work with you, your appropriate staff, to address these hurdles that still need to be cleared. I'm really excited, the people of West Virginia are excited about the administration's very clear directive. We're going to cut through red tape, we're going to cut down burdensome regulations, we're going to get projects moving forward, and we have seen that already, but we just want to keep the foot on the pedal, and there's still some opportunities, I think, whether it be OSM and the AML pilot program or Fish and Wildlife relating to King Coal. We'd like to work with your folks on that.
I'm absolutely committed. I had some good news. The Fish and Wildlife recently did finish a consulting on a segment in 2 days. Yeah. So that was light speed for government. But on
so
the
we could have this by Thursday or Friday of this week. This is great.
But you know, some of it is structural. You know, on the fish and salmon about our regulatory framework, and what the goal is to make sure we maintain accountability, oversight, but make the decision sooner, one way or the other, yes or no on projects. Well, and when you have multiple agencies and independently produced biological opinions sequentially, that's why we're seeing a simple replacement of a bridge in sometimes is 17 years. Right. So if we work together, we can do it better. And then we got to figure out a way to incorporate innovation into our regulatory framework. Because a lot of times, you know, I think everyone's goal is to improve safety, reliability, accountability, environmental stewardship. But sometimes the government regulatory framework doesn't work when new techniques, new science, new innovation will save time, cost, and we have to look at being flexible enough on our regulatory framework to allow innovation into that framework, so we can move smartly in a responsible manner.
Just one final comment. When you mentioned the OIG, you referenced a stack of reports on your desk. Your staff shared a 3-ring binder. A year ago, before this committee and then subsequent discussions, and I just wanted to give you a quick minute to the extent you're publicly willing to address it. I wanted to thank you publicly because I do believe we have, unfortunately, a past practice under Interior and the EPA in particular, sue and settle, third-party groups that had maybe nudging from EPA and others to do certain things, taxpayer dollars being misused to drive an ideological agenda. And to the extent you're able to discuss today, and I'm looking forward to looking at the OIG reports, with this year under your belt, I knew you were committed to fettering out some of the abuses and the mistrust of the taxpayer dollars that has occurred in the prior administration. What has the OIG been able to find, and what are you able to share?
And I would say there was 3 areas. There was sue and settle, which a regulation would be put in place. It would invite a lawsuit. The lawsuit would be settled, both monetary and then a regulatory fix without going through the process of regulation. Compensatory mitigation, where in order to get a permit, you would have to, in some cases, almost be extorted to do it. And there's cases right down the road here about a power company that wanted to put a power line in. The Park Service opposed it. In order to get the permit, they had to deliver $90 million to a few 501c3s for the idea that somehow this power line, which I did an aerial survey, I looked at it, the power line itself, yes, could be seen if you walked off the path and you went in the far little area and the power line crossed the Captain Smith Trail, which is the James River. But of course, the power line could be seen for a little bit of an area, but then so could the power plant itself and Busch Gardens and the Navy derelict fleet. But in order to get the permit, they had to pay about $90 million. And no question that it upset people. And then some of the grants. And grants has not just been a problem of a previous administration. It's a long-going problem that we didn't have proper procedures to make sure that conflict of interest wouldn't happen, that if your wife is a grantee, that there's a process. And some of it with the conservation community, there are a lot of husband and wives that work in that area, and that's fine. But if you do have a conflict of interest, like in the Congress, you should identify it and make sure you're not part of making that decision. And so we put processes in place to make sure that that didn't happen, and I'm confident that we're going to get better. But also, we need to make sure that we exercise funds upon congressional intent. I don't want to hold funds. It's your decision as a Congress to fund. It's my decision to execute those funding lines.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks, Mr. Secretary, for being with us. I've got 3 topics I'm going to try to cover super fast. First, along the lines of what Ms. Pingree was asking about, I had a bunch of town halls last week in my district. The issue of offshore drilling came up a bunch. I know you testified in front of Senator Cantwell's committee, and you're keenly aware of the broad opposition to Washington State's inclusion in the plan. You know, obviously we've got fisheries and shellfish growing and marine tourism and shipping, all of which are really fundamental to our economy and are largely incompatible with oil and gas development. We have a letter that's actually both bicameral and bipartisan outlining the concerns from our region. I've got a copy of it, and with the chair's and ranking member's permission, I'd love to submit it for the record. I know that you told Senator Cantwell you were going to mark Washington State down as opposed to drilling. So I'm hoping I can ask you today if you're prepared to announce that you'll withdraw our state from consideration, as you've done with Florida. And if not, given the near universal opposition to drilling off Washington's coast, what's preventing the department from making that determination? And has anybody expressed an interest in drilling off of our coast? And if you can share that too, I'd be interested.
Putting everything on, and if I would have left Florida off in the beginning, it would have been arbitrary and capricious. But again, this is a plan and not a rule. So everyone's in the process. Washington. There was little or no resources of oil and gas off the coast of Oregon or Washington. There is no infrastructure to support an oil and gas industry off the coast of Oregon or Washington. And there is, I would say, passionate opposition to do so. In the case of Washington with the coal terminals, Washington itself has an enormous leverage as a state. And I've talked to your governor on it, but because Washington has the first, I think, 3 or 4 miles is state waters, Washington can restrict the federal's activity when it we have to, if you were to drill off the coast of Washington, and if there were resources, which as a geologist, I haven't seen any interest or resources there, you'd somehow have to bring it to shore. Well, you'd have to go through the state waters. Similarly to with the, Massachusetts did not or strenuously objected to a wind farm that was pretty close to the coastline. What they did is they revoked the ability for that wind farm's energy to get to shore through state waters. Yeah. So we will continue with the process. Our team went out there. I've talked to your governor. I've talked to, I think, almost every congressional member, including your 2 senators. So I think I have a pretty good idea where Washington sits.
Thank you. I want to ask you about an issue I brought up when you were here last year, and that's the settlement negotiations between the Park Service and the City of Port Angeles regarding the operation and maintenance of the Elwha water facilities. I know we've engaged with you a lot over the past year, and I'm grateful for your attention to this issue and your staff's attention, particularly given there's just very substantial economic consequences to the city if an agreement can't be reached. As you know, the committee included language in the FY18 omnibus that directs the Park Service to report to the committee on how it intends to meet its obligations under the Elwha River Ecosystem and Fisheries Restoration Act prior to transferring any of those water facilities, and basically urging the Park Service to work it out with the city by this June. This June's right around the corner, and so I'd just like to ask for your continued partnership to ensure that the Park Service has the resources it needs to carry out this committee's direction and hopefully to resolve this issue in a way that works for the city.
Yeah, my understanding is they're in negotiation, although the two sides remain apart. And you have my insurance. I'm going to get personally involved with it because I just want it settled.
Thank you. We do too.
Also in the state of Washington, fisheries are an enormous concern of mine. I think our fisheries have been allowed to deteriorate. I've talked to many of the tribes, and they're concerned, and we have to work together to make sure we rekindle our fisheries, particularly with salmon. And there's some environmentalists that we're going to have to work through, but it's hurting the economy of Washington, and it's hurting the tribes. And a lot of our fisheries have atrophied, and we need to reinvest in them, in my opinion.
The Elwha removal, I think, was a real success story, the dam removal, but it won't be if it ends up with a giant burn on the local community. Do you have time for one quick one? Finally, I want to thank you for the attention to the maintenance backlog within the Park Service. We've got a bipartisan bill called the National Park Service Legacy Act that would establish a permanent fund dedicated to paying down the maintenance backlog. I know that my good friend on the committee, Mike Simpson, who is ironically down for maintenance himself on his knee, has also introduced another bipartisan solution on this. This is a big deal because there's a lot of concern about substantially jacking up the entrance fees and how that could affect some of the gateway communities. I know that there's difference in some of the specifics on these bills, but I know we want to see something cross the finish line that actually addresses this maintenance backlog, and just want to ask for your continued attention to this and partnership as we work to hopefully establish a dedicated fund to addressing the maintenance backlog.
What I'm hoping is that there are multiple bills that approach it somewhat differently, but we need to address the backlog of maintenance. And there are several senators that looked at our bill and said, well, if it should pass and you get the backlog of maintenance caught up, what then? Are we going to be in the same box the next 10 years? So there's a movement to make it more permanent, structured. With energy, this is what I thought. I thought at the end of the day, if you're going to make in all the above, we're seeing a trend on the East Coast to go more wind off the coast, similar to oil and gas out in the Gulf that funds LWCF. And the approach was net dollars going into Treasury. So it didn't affect LWCF, didn't affect Go Mesa. The proposal we had didn't affect any program. It was just whatever was left from congressional intent going into Treasury net, half of it would go back into a infrastructure account. Now that was our proposal, Senator Alexander, bipartisan, but we are very supportive of any mechanism that is responsible in order to address a backlog, and it's not getting any better.
Yeah.
And lastly, if I can take 1 minute. The doors. So I read it like you, that the doors were $139,000. So I didn't even know they were my doors. But it's part of a long-term maintenance program of the building. And so why are they $139,000? Well, we brought it down to $55,000, but we had this little thing called the National Historic Preservation Act. And when you have a building or a facility that sits on the historic register, you're bound to go through SHPL and consultation and the whole works. It would be helpful if we work together in this to make sure that common sense can be applied. There are some buildings, absolutely, we need to make sure they're restored to original, all among many of them. But some of our holdings, we don't need to, if a roof is sugar pine shake, we don't need to replace it to sugar pine shake. We can find alternate shakes that's a lot cheaper, more cost effective, that also, it saves our maintenance dollars. And so we make sure that we can get more done for little or less expense. So I hope that this is a bipartisan issue on the National Historic Preservation Act, particularly I think it's Chapter 106 in there. If we work together and we're going through what legislative fixes would be, what do I have the power to as a secretary, and what legislative fixes to allow a little more flexibility and common sense to be applied on some of these projects as we go through the maintenance. Otherwise, we're gonna run out of money.
Common sense is also an endangered species around here. Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome here, Mr. Secretary. The burning issue of the day, obviously, in this building is, are you on Facebook? No, I'm just kidding.
I am not on Facebook.
Well, maybe if we talked about Facebook, we'd have more cameras here so they could see the great job that you're doing here. But I'm going to bring it to something that, boring I bug you about every time I see you, much to your chagrin, I'm sure, but the Great Lakes. And the idea that the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has helped protect and restore the habitats of the Great Lakes and the species that are native to the Great Lakes and keep harmful invasive species out of the Great Lakes, which I found that previous editions of this, when we had problems with the zebra mussels and quagga mussels, actually affect you in Montana. I don't know how the hell they got out there, but they managed to. You've been very important in to help us restore and protect the Great Lakes, which I refer to not just as a lake, but or a series of lake, but a national treasure, of which there are a few of us members who are all in cahoots about bugging you on. But we received $271 million to undertake 872 GLRI programs from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and this was the information as of February of 18. Yet, to no one's surprise, I guess, on this committee, the administration has once again proposed to virtually eliminate all the funding for the GLRI in fiscal year 2019. And I know this is an important issue, and we talked about it again last year, but I was hoping that maybe there'd be some time where you might be able to get a commitment from you that we could come and visit the Great Lakes, and I'm sure Ms. Capter, who's not here today, would be glad and proud also to take you out on Lake Erie, and I'm sure Ms. McCullum would be glad to entertain you on the Great Lakes so you could see firsthand the tremendous work that's being done. And it's, I would say, the high watermark on how government should operate, and I'm glad that you're a party to it. Secondly, I'd like to understand what you're doing to make sure that we continue in this U.S. Fish, Wildlife, and the U.S. Geological Survey and other agencies that we can maintain and protect and continue to restore the Great Lakes. And if cuts were going to be made, I understand that, sir, but if they're going to have any cuts, could you provide examples of what cuts or what was going to be significantly curtailed if cuts do take place?
On the Great Lakes, we receive about $64 million to the EPA. So our budgets of the EPA are reflective as they get cuts. We do, but we receive about $64 million. Our budget adds about, I think, $13 million for Asian carp on it, and some of it is structural. Mm-hmm. How do we get to resolution, and how do we address a problem? Again, on the trout and the salmon. Mm-hmm. Same thing that happens in the Great Lakes.
Certainly. Is
that you can put significant more funding in place, but if it doesn't result in actually moving the needle or doing something to the ground, that's part of the issue. Is that I think structurally we have to change, and the reorganization looks at how to do it better to make sure we emphasize things that matter in the Great Lakes and those regions rather than from Washington, D.C. That would be helpful on it. And then, a budget request from the executive is just that. It's a budget request. So we have authority for me the priority in Interior was infrastructure and reorganization, so we can make the decisions that affect better, and then focus on a solution lead to any action. Great to study it, love studying, but some of the studies, less studying and more action would be helpful in a lot of these areas, including the Great Lakes.
Well, I certainly appreciate that, and I appreciate that you're focusing on it. And the idea being, and people who are working in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative have to share the information, so you don't have studies upon studies, but actually using those studies and implementing them and the different agencies. But while you bring that up, you know, one of the things that we've been dealing with is the Army Corps of Engineers, who have had this study going about how we're going to prevent the Asian carp from actually getting into the Great Lakes. And they came up with what they said was 7 different options, one being do nothing, so that's not really an option. And we're still waiting for some finality to what it is that they're going to do. But obviously, in the meantime, the Fish and Wildlife Service is the most important component of making sure in the interim that we don't have this issue, because, as I've said time and time again, once the Asian carp is into the Great Lakes, especially Lake Erie being the shallowest of the lakes, it's game, set, match. They're such voracious eaters, so they'll ruin the habitat there. So I was wondering if you know of, or if you could foresee what cuts, if any, hopefully not, but what cuts might be in line to or staff reductions in 2019 that would scale back those Asian carp operations?
I would say, given the importance of the Asian carp, we have about 13 million there. And how successful have we been? We moved about 48,000 carp on some fish herding exercises. It's not enough, but we got better at it. And so I think we're going to continue and probably accelerate that. The U.S. Geological Survey and the Fish and Wildlife are looking at also some technologies that will help us on that. But we are, and I'm personally aware of the issue. I wasn't from Montana so much, and now I understand the issue of the Asian carp and the zebra mussels, both. Those are a problem on irrigation, and there's some I would say, some encouraging developments on zebra mussel from the USGS, as well as there's some encouraging developments on Asian carp and how to manage it. And we'll continue to make sure the resources are there to go forward.
And if I may be so rude as to invite myself on, if you were ever go to see these Asian carp operations where they're doing this herding and other things, so it could understand what it is you're doing. And we'd like to find a solution to the problem that we hope will never come about in the Great Lakes. But certainly,
I was on my schedule in August, as I understand it.
A lovely time of year to be out on the Great
One of the
Lakes,
best,
and
I
our chairman
understand.
can attest to it. As
I
he
once
was
was
out there.
invited to go walleye fishing in August, but somebody lost the invitation.
They found out that you were coming, so they bumped me. That's what you don't understand on that expedition. But thank you very much for your time, and I yield back.
And we did increase, by the way, zebra mussels about 3 million. And some of it's on there's some promising USGS technology that we think has.
It's a big problem in California, too.
Yeah.
Ms. McCollum.
Mr. Chair, before I ask my question, I want to go back. I had mentioned in my opening statements, I spoke about Bears Ears and the Grand Staircase Monument. I'm just going to focus on the Grand Monument here for just a second. I cited why I said what I did based on a New York Times article, and you in your kind of came back and said no, that coal and mining was not part of the decision on how the rescission of the monument went. But I based my statement on memos from the Interior Department, which talks about one of the plateaus located in the monument contains one of the largest coal deposits in the United States. The Interior Department memo issued in spring of 2017 said about 11.62 billion tons are technologically recoverable. The story goes on to cite Interior staff preparing a report on each national monument with a yellow highlighter on the documents, emphasizing the need to examine and detail the annual production of coal, gas, and renewables, if any, on site. The article goes on to talk about how there were many, many meetings with people from the mining industries. But so I wanted to be clear, Mr. Secretary, I didn't pull that out of the air. I took it from a New York Times article which cited department memos.
And your opening statement was on Bears Ears.
No, I also had Grand Staircase in it,
In
too.
regard-
And
in-
Mr. Secretary, we're not going to, we can talk about this later, but there were maps that both the New York Times had looked at, and maps and yellow highlighter used in the department on this. I want to get to
I don't
my.
take the New York Times as a credible source on such things, but we'll take it as that.
I think when you turn over under public documents that actually have interior memos that are cited in a news source, that would be rather credible if they're citing the department. Mr. Secretary, you and I have talked about this before. There's a 20-year withdrawal mineral lease currently under consideration for the watershed that contains the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness Area in Voyageurs National Park. You've been vocal in your support for a similar 20-year mining ban in Paradise Valley in Montana. You clearly understand that there are some places that are just too precious to mine. In December, your solicitor's office overturned the right of the Forest Service to deny consent for 2 mining leases on the doorsteps of the Boundary Waters. The principal deputy solicitor's schedule shows that he repeatedly met with lobbyists from the foreign-owned mining company, but does not appear that he consulted with any of the stakeholders who oppose the automatic renewals. Secretary Zinke, to the best of your knowledge, did your solicitor meet with stakeholders other than representatives of Twin Metals Mining Company before issuing their opinion? Were there any meetings with stakeholders presenting the strong legal case against non-discretionary interpretation of the leases? Did your solicitor's office seek input from either the Department of Agriculture's General Counsel, from the Department of Justice, who was actively defending the Forest Service's consent denials against a lawsuit from Twin Metals? So did you have an opportunity to personally look at the solicitor's opinion before it was issued? And the reason why I'm bringing this up is I'm concerned and I'm confused about the criteria that are being used by you to determine which public lands need to be protected from mining. If the Forest Service finds that there's no significant impact of withdrawal in the Superior National Forest, will that be enough for you to move forward on the 20-year ban on mining in this unique, precious, and vulnerable watershed?
Well, first, I agree there are some areas that are too precious to mine. In regards to the previous administration's removal for preferred leasing, our solicitor teams viewed that as unlawful and undefendable in court, and they did confer with the Department of Justice, which also had the same view. Losing in court would cost the Interior as much as hundreds of millions of dollars. So the correct path, in our opinion, was to do a process called NEPA. So that's what's going on. In order to remove and do a taking, it has to be on the basis of science. The NEPA process is undergoing.
Mr. Secretary, my question, and thank you for saying that you did consult with the Department of Justice, but one of my questions was, did the solicitor's office meet with anyone else besides representatives of Twin Metals before issuing this opinion?
I'll have to look at the records and who we met with, but it's a matter of public record. But we did coordinate with agriculture on it. But again, the solicitors from our talented lawyers, career lawyers, also viewed that withdrawing preferred leasing was unlawful. And so the right path to look at it was continue that and then initiate a NEPA so we can make a decision based on science.
Thank you. I look forward to finding out about who has met with. And as you and I both know, and as we see on TV every night, There are talented attorneys that can come up with two different opinions. So I respect that your solicitors come up with one opinion. The solicitors of the previous administration came up with another. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I beg your indulgence and your understanding. I thank you that appreciating that we had 3 hearings this morning and an Intel hearing as well, so a total of 4. And thank you for letting me come late, Ms. Yeah, you appreciate. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here. I'm going to thank you for 3 things and then ask you a question, if I could. The first thing is, and I really mean this, thanks for your leadership. We live in tumultuous times when everything that was partisan anyway has become hyper-partisan, and many times it becomes too personal. I believe you're trying to thread a needle. I really do. And I believe you're listening and trying to understand people's objections, and we appreciate that. The second thing is thank you for Grand Escalante and for Bears Ears and representing one of those monuments. I can tell you that was the right thing for Utah. It was the right thing for the local communities, and more than that, it was the right thing for the American people, because we have protected those areas that deserve the protections that we've afforded them. At the same time, we've opened up some economic opportunities for communities that are desperately in need of it. And again, I think we threaded the needle there where we had conflicting priorities, and I think we found a nice compromise on that. I'm grateful this president did that. I don't think any other person who was running for office would have had the courage to do what he did. And speaking for the people in Utah, we're grateful for that. And third thing I'll thank you for is for this. I know that this is not without controversy as well, and there are some objections that some people have, and we had some concerns as well, one of them being the state directors and the fact that they would still remain state directors and a few other things. But once again, I think that this is it's a bit of a shakeup, but in an organization that needs a shakeup every 100 years or so. And I think it was we're excited to see what we hope will be a better outcome. Now, if I could ask a question, and I know the committee's going to look at me and just go, oh, and by the way, before I go on, Ms. McCullough, if I could, you are someone that I have tremendous respect for, and I really mean that. I'd be happy to talk with you a little bit about Grand Escalante and how the impacts that that's had on the communities there, and give you my perspective on that. I think it might be helpful if we were to have a conversation regarding that. I don't know that I'll necessarily change your mind on anything, but it might be helpful for us to have our own private conversation regarding that. Again, I hate to be, I'll use an old joke, I hate to beat a dead horse, but I want to talk about horses. And we didn't get what we were hoping, and I know the chairman here did everything that he could to advocate for this issue of mine. But if you care about these animals, we got to do better. We've got to make situations better for them rather than not. And I'm wondering if you could give some indications of where you think you can go with your own authorities.
Yeah, in general, and I think no one loves a horse more than I do up front. So I love horses, and horses are iconic. But this is where the numbers are. The ground will hold about 27,000 healthy horses. We have 108,000 horses. 45,000 are in captivity. We're spending $81 million on the horse program. And what the current practice has been is when a horse population gets larger, we go out, we round up, and we take the excess off, and then the excess goes off into either corrals, which is inhumane for wild horses to be in captivity. But we really haven't been able to address the growth. So every time we get to this period, Congress will put a rider in, either the House or the Senate. It's a fight to get the rider in or out, and then we don't address the growth. So what we're looking at doing is either birth control, spading, neutering, but looking at rounding up the horses in a humane way and focus on the growth. It is unsustainable to continue doing what we're doing, and quite frankly, the most inhumane thing we can do is no action. Right. So I accept that we're working with the Humane Society. I've had the first meeting ever with stakeholders that are passionate horse advocates. So we're trying to say, all right, this is what we got to do. And I'm an advocate, quite frankly, of rounding the horses up and going on the spading, neutering, birth control, because that's really the only option we have on the table to focus on growth and focus on making sure we have healthy herds and striving to that number. We're also working with some Indian tribes. Some of our reservations have a lot of land that are open spaces, so we're working with some of our Indian nations to accommodate some of the horses, rather than as we round up and neuter and spade, rather than they spend the rest of their existence in a cubicle. It'd probably be better, I think, more humane to have them on open range. So we're working on that.
Well, I'll conclude just again thanking you. And if you look at these horses in captivity, there are thousands of them sitting in enough space where they have a few feet to move, and they just sit there in the dust all day. And it's very unfortunate for them. And you know, I think we've got to do something permanent. The spay and the neutering, the inoculations, I think we know now, just aren't effective and nearly impossible to administer effectively. So we appreciate you taking a more aggressive stand. And again, I take you to your word, having observed you ride your horse to work the first day, that you're sincere when you say you care about these animals. I am as well, and hopefully we can have a better outcome for them. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Ms. Capter, do you have a quick question would you like to ask? Since I'm trying to. Is it ending? I got a question I'm going to ask. You want me to ask my question? And
If there's time.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to ask you first, though, Ms. Pinker. You have a quick question?
Want me to go first?
Okay, sure.
Okay. I know you're going to run out of time, so a couple of thoughts that I had after you and I discussed oil drilling, and I will not beat this dead topic because it's not dead, but you started out by saying that the department needs to raise money. You talked about reducing oil revenues, and I think we all appreciate that you're looking for ways to help balance a budget and raise money, but as you said on an earlier question, some areas are too precious to mine. Coastal waters are too precious to drill for oil, so just another thought to keep in your mind. I want to just briefly talk about this whole issue around science, denial of science, climate change. You know, it's kind of a recurring theme with this administration, and I think many of us are always on guard looking for places where this topic will be purged or not discussed. Again, coming from a coastal state where we're already worried about sea level rising, changes in our fisheries, sea level temperature changing, ocean acidification, it's already had a huge impact on my state, and there's a lot of fear around it. Again, because of some of our biggest industries. So my understanding is that there is a pending report about the national parks and the impact of climate change on the national parks. And there's been reporting to say that there's been some editing of taking climate change out of the document and removing any references to things about human-made climate change and greenhouse gases. And I'm not in the debate anymore. Humans have an impact on climate change. I'm just done with that. And you have said that you're not editing it. That's not going to happen. So I would just like to hear your reassurance that these reports are either something that happened in the past and you're going to change, or it's really not going on. And when that report comes out, I personally don't want to see it edited to remove any reference that we have a coastal national park in our state. And again, I think it's extremely important that departments like yours are paying attention. And the second thing that's somewhat related, I just want to put in there, is some controversy around Susan Combs becoming the acting Secretary for Fish and Wildlife. And, you know, excuse me, because I don't think I know her, and so I don't have any personal issues here. But because she's been frequently noted as someone who opposes the Endangered Species Act, and I know this committee in particular, we have differing points of view on it and when it's well used and when it's not. But it, again, coming from a state where the bald eagle has made an amazing comeback in a community like mine, you can see one virtually every single day fishing, and that is the result of the changes from the the Endangered Species Act. So I know it's a complicated issue, but it plays a really important role. And to have someone in that position who comes at it with an opposition to that, I just want to know how you think, she can perform that job with so much bias.
First, on the national park document, I never change even a comma on scientific things. So how did that report get to you? Because it didn't get to us. Nobody in Interior in Washington ever saw that document. It's a draft document as far as I understand. It was FOIA'd from a university, and it was still in a deliberative process. So nobody, no political, has ever seen that document, and I haven't seen the document. So I want an investigation how that document got around to the press. It got before even we had a chance to look at it. I think that's fair.
Fair question.
Another report with a U.S. document that I wanted to see before they released it, it had to do with ANWR. Because I want to know why the USGS report was so radically different, this is an assessment on natural resources, was so radically different than a same assessment just conducted a few years before. And they were significantly different in assessment of resources, given the data set was very similar. And I want to know what techniques they were using. So
given that it shouldn't, I agree, you should have the ability to have a draft document and people state their opinions, but can you assure me that you are not going to deny any references to climate change and that you will allow for the inclusion in documents from the Department of Interior that have a human impact on climate change?
Yeah, if it's a scientific report, all right, I'm not going to change a comma of it because I think that's the integrity. And my director of USGS, he's an astronaut. And it's taken a year to get an astronaut with a PhD in science that's had a top secret SCI security clearance. He's probably arguably the best director, most qualified director we've had in the history of the USGS. And that's saying something because we had John Wesley Powell and some icons. It's taken over a year. And with Susan Combs, that's not her permanent place. She's been nominated to be number 3, not in Fish and Wildlife, but there's holds on her from a few named senators that I would like to have her confirmed.
So we all have our issues with the Senate now and then. So again, will you confirm that while she's in that role, she will not be actively working to undermine the Endangered Species Act?
She will not be actively to undermine any of our environmental protections that are reasonable, although we both agree that Endangered Species Act is that it is very difficult when a species has recovered to either downlist or remove a species. And quite frankly, when a species has recovered, I'd rather spend the money and effort looking at species that are in challenge, because we have a lot of species that are in trouble. So we got to look at the processes. When we put a species on and a species is recovered, we should all celebrate that the Endangered Species Act has been positive, and it was a Dick Nixon bill. So great, we should celebrate in our victories. And then we should focus our efforts on the species that really need help, but we need to look at off-ramps too. And so we're looking at that as part of a structure without deteriorating in any way my responsibility of being the steward of your public lands.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. A couple quick points. You mentioned recovery of endangered species. Don't need to comment. Obviously we're having a discussion here about the gray wolf in the Great Lakes in Wyoming, and we have some disagreements, but a lot of people believe that that's a recovered species. So I'll leave that to next year, but I just bring it up. Oil. There is one state that does have oil. There's no doubt about it. You have a house in Santa Barbara. You can gaze across, and
my wife does.
Wife has a house in Santa Barbara.
She's lucky.
There's a lot of oil in California. I think we're the 3rd largest oil-producing state in the union. Some people believe the largest off-coast supply outside of Alaska in the United States is in California, probably in the Santa Barbara Gulch. As you look at that, and I know you must, there are technologies that are available today to slant drill without using coastal rigs, especially off Vandenberg and others has been studied. So I hope you look at all technologies that are available as you look at California. Also, California has the largest depository in Monterey Shale in various counties in the interior part of the state of California, which you're aware of. But I just bring that up as no discussion because it is very controversial within my state. And so there are ways of doing this, including the local communities and the state, as far as the revenue, since the revenue in California is significant. And while we are talking about California, the earthquake early warning system, and that just doesn't apply to California, it applies to the state of Oregon, the state of Washington. It's not a matter of if we're going to have a significant earthquake in the future, it's just a matter of when. And it's my belief, along with others, this is a bipartisan issue, is that these sensors that we're putting in up and down the state, which is USGS has been very involved in. We put a substantial amount of money in this appropriation bill, about $13 million to increase the program, another $10 million for the infrastructure costs that will be hopefully online here shortly. And despite the FY19 budget request, that obviously you zero out the program, but will you work with USGS to make sure that the congressional intent is fully carried out and the program is prioritized for the public safety it will provide? We hope to have this online, working with Caltech and USGS soon to provide a warning system that could save thousands and thousands of lives.
I will commit, and it's the power of your leadership that it is remains strong in the budget, as well as University of Oregon is working on it as well, my armada. So yeah. I'm aware of the importance.
And the state of Washington, we have that whole zone area up there, so it's.
And if I can add real quickly on the oil and gas, the Coastal Commission and the state of California also have a say on oil and gas, even if you were to do a slant rig. And I believe there are companies that looked at it at Vandenberg, that there was oil deposits, particularly a gas play off the coast that was reachable by horizontal drilling. And the Coastal Commission and the state regulatory framework has a big say whether or not they're going to go forward.
No, we're a difficult state. We have time for a real quick question from Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back, Mr. Secretary. Glad to have you.
The Secretary has a hard exit in 5 minutes because he's got to go.
I hear you.
But I do offer this. I said in the very beginning when I came in that I will meet with this committee outside of a hearing in a working group, and I would do that. I offer that.
Thank you. Also earlier, I know Mr. Joyce asked questions about the Asian carp, and Mr. Secretary, you mentioned it as a priority. Thank you very much. We don't want them in the Great Lakes. You also had a conference recently to a large group of energy developers about the potential for offshore wind. I want to let you know this member supports that, and in fact, we know the Great Lakes have about a minimum of 700 gigawatts of power that are uncaptured at this point. And the first offshore project is being proposed near Cleveland, Ohio, LeadCo. And I wanted to draw your attention to that, but also to state for the record that I do not support the request to cut renewable energy at the Department of Interior by half. And we're going to try to fix that as this bill moves along. But we very much welcome your comments to that offshore wind organization. My question relates to USGS. Because of the condition of Lake Erie right now, and I want to reiterate Mr. Joyce's warm invitation to you to come to our area, Lake Erie, the shallowest of the Great Lakes. We are facing a very, very serious crisis there, dealing with the largest watershed in the Great Lakes, which empty into Lake Erie. Your budget proposes to cut the USGS. And again, I'm hoping we can fix that here, because a quarter cut to the budget doesn't help us, and especially because the cuts include the contaminant biology and toxic substance hydrology accounts, which are so important to us because it is toxic microcystin that is causing all the difficulty in our water system. So I am troubled by the fact that you are cutting programs that are the most important to science as we try to shepherd the freshwater resource that is so precious in our country. Could you comment on the fact that our water quality issues in freshwater are getting worse, but you're cutting the budget to fix it?
Real quickly, on renewables, is that our budget reflects the demand. There is a greater demand going offshore, but there is a lesser demand on onshore right now. So our budget looked at the USGS forecast and BOEM forecast of renewables, and our budget request is aligned to that. We'll share the same data we have. We just want to make sure renewables is important. The president's policy is all the above.
Good.
And so at the end of the day, if we need to move things around, we can do it by a programming letter too. If the demand is up or down, we want to make sure we have an appropriate amount to accommodate our energy policy, which is all the above. And so we'll share the same data that you have, that we have. So if we're short in that, we would adjust it because we're all the above.
All right.
On your second question, I'm sure, I'm sorry, was on the list, geological survey?
Yes.
Yeah, we also have some expensive programs. We have the Landsat 9. We think we can do much better with Landsat 2 by opening up for competitive bidding. That would save us some money. I'll admit, our water is at risk. Our invasive species, we need to get a handle on and control. Some of it is looking at better technology, particularly with the Asian carp. And there's some promising technology for zebra mussels, which is a big issue. But I'll work with you on it because I understand how important it is. And the Great Lakes matter, too. They matter politically, economically, they matter morally to this country. And I'll work with you on it. We think the reorganization, which I'll be glad to talk in detail with you on it, we think it's best on the reorganization to put more authority in the front line to address some of these regional problems because they get lost at the federal level.
Mr. Secretary, could I ask you, before you come out to Ohio, could you identify a person within USGS that could work with us on a topographical map of the watershed that must be managed in a much more thoughtful way so that we aren't polluting the lake? And
I have the best map on watersheds. It's broken down to every basin. It's
Good.
magnificent.
We need that. We need people to understand that it isn't flat, that it actually rolls somewhere when a drop of water falls off. I would really appreciate if you could, if we could have that attendant to your visit. That would be marvelous. It'd be really. And Mr. Chairman, I just have to state for that, Rotary International has selected Lake Erie because of its condition and made it as high a priority as their priority to eliminate polio, which they were successful in doing globally. It is that important. So we have stakeholders that want to help, but we need the technology, science, and resources to fix the problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for coming out to this hearing today. I'd like to, Ms. McCullum asked a question of me, and I think it's a good idea that hopefully that we can get together at some point in a non-hearing setting to talk about reorganization and get a better understanding of this, so we can do that in the near future. We'll set up a time to do that. I appreciate your coming out, and we are adjourned.